Academic.
Academic. Connected with education, especially studying in schools and universities. For example, high/low academic standards. Academy. A school or college for special training. For example, she trained at the Royal Academy of Music.
Acknowledge.
Acknowledge. To accept that something is true. For example, acknowledge something.
Acquisition. The act of getting something, especially knowledge, a skill, etc. For example, theories of child language acquisition.
Advance. If knowledge, technology, etc. advances, it develops and improves. For example, technology is advancing at an incredibly rapid pace.
Analyze.
Analyze. To examine the nature or structure of something, especially by separating it into its parts, in order to understand or explain it. For example, analyze something.
Analyses.
Analysis. The detailed study or examination of something in order to understand more about it, the result of the study. For example, statistical data analysis. Analyst. A person whose job involves examining facts or materials in order to give an opinion on them. For example, a political financial analyst. Applicant. A person who makes a formal request for something, applies for it, especially for a job, a place at a college or university, etc. For example, there were over 500 applicants for the job.
Application.
Application. A formal, often written, request for something, such as a job, permission to do something or a place at a college or university. For example, a planning patent visa application.
Apply. To make a formal request, usually in writing, for something such as a job, a loan, permission for something, a place at a university, etc. For example, you should apply in person/by letter.
Architecture. The art and study of designing buildings. For example, to study architecture.
Attendance. The act of being present at a place, for example at school. For example, attendance at these lectures is not compulsory.
Background. The details of a person's family, education, experience, etc. For example, somebody's ethnic, genetic, cultural background.
Big. Large in size, degree, amount, etc. For example, a big man/house/increase.
Campus. The buildings of a university or college and the land around them. For example, university or college campuses.
Catalog.
Catalog. A complete list of items, for example of things that people can look at or buy. For example, a mail order catalog equals a book showing goods for sale to be sent to people's homes.
Catch.
Catch. An act of catching something, for example a ball. For example, Roger made some brilliant catches at today's game.
Cent. A coin and unit of money worth 1% of the main unit of money in many countries, for example of the US dollar or of the euro. For example, a 1-minute phone call to the UK cost 10 cents.
Check.
Check. An act of making sure that something is safe, correct or in good condition by examining it. For example, could you give the tires a check?
Check.
Check. an act of making sure that something is safe, correct, or in good condition by examining it. For example, could you give the tires a check?
Chemistry.
Chemistry. The scientific study of the structure of substances, how they react when combined or in contact with one another, and how they behave under different conditions. For example, a degree in chemistry. Cite. To mention something as a reason or an example, or in order to support what you are saying. For example, cite something.
Class. A group of students who are taught together. For example, in your class.
Classic.
Classic. Accepted or deserving to be accepted as one of the best or most important of its kind. For example, a classic film/story/car/game.
Classic.
Classic. Accepted or deserving to be accepted as one of the best or most important of its kind. For example, a classic film/story/car/game.
Classical.
Classical. Relating to classical music. For example, a classical composer/musician/pianist.
Classification. The act or process of putting people or things into a group or class, equals of classifying them. For example, a style of music that defies classification, equals is like no other.
Classroom.
Classroom. A room where a class of children or students is taught. For example, classroom activities.
College. In the UK, a place where students go to study or to receive training after they have left school. For example, a secretarial college.
Compare.
Compare. To examine people or things to see how they are similar, and how they are different. For example, compare A and B.
Competent.
Competent. Having enough skill or knowledge to do something well or to the necessary standard. For example, he's very competent in his work.
Composer. A person who writes music, especially classical music. For example, Verdi was a prolific composer of operas.
Correct.
Correct. To make something right or accurate, for example by changing it or removing mistakes. For example, correct something.
Course.
Course. A series of lessons or lectures on a particular subject. For example, a French/chemistry course.
Curriculum. The subjects that are included in a course of study or taught in a school, college, etc. For example, the school curriculum should be as broad as possible.
Data. Facts or information, especially when examined and used to find out things or to make decisions. For example, we collected publicly available data over a 10-day period.
Degree.
Degree. A unit for measuring temperature. For example, at degrees.
Density. The quality of being dense, the degree to which something is dense. For example, the population density in this city is very high.
Dimension.
Dimension. A measurement in space, for example how high, wide or long something is. For example, we measured the dimensions of the kitchen. Diplomat. A person whose job is to represent his or her country in a foreign country, for example, in an embassy. For example, Washington's top diplomat in Havana.
Dirt. Any substance that makes something dirty, for example dust, soil or mud. For example, his clothes were covered in dirt.
Economics.
Economics. The study of how a society organizes its money, trade and industry. For example, he studied politics and economics at Yale. Educate. To teach somebody over a period of time at a school, university, etc. For example, be educated.
Educated.
Educated. Having had the kind of education mentioned, having been to the school, college or university mentioned. For example, privately educated children. Education. A process of teaching, training and learning, especially in schools, colleges or universities, to improve knowledge and develop skills. For example, primary/elementary education.
Educational. Connected with education. For example, children with special educational needs. Elementary. In or connected with the first stages of a course of study. For example, an elementary English course. Endorse. To say publicly that you support a person, statement, or course of action. For example, I wholeheartedly endorse his remarks.
Enough. To the necessary degree. For example, I hadn't trained enough for the game. Enroll. To arrange for yourself or for somebody else to officially join a course, school, etc. For example, you need to enroll before the end of August.
Equally.
Equally. To the same degree, in the same or in a similar way. For example, diet and exercise are equally important. Equation. A statement showing that two amounts or values are equal, for example 2x plus y equals 54. For example, the numbers on the right-hand side of the equation.
Essay.
Essay. A short piece of writing by a student as part of a course of study. For example, I have to write an essay this weekend.
Exam. A formal written, spoken or practical test, especially at school or college, to see how much you know about a subject or what you can do. For example, to take an exam.
Examination.
Examination. A formal written, spoken or practical test, especially at school or college, to see how much you know about a subject or what you can do. For example, successful candidates in GCSE examinations.
Examine. To consider or study an idea, a subject, etc. very carefully. For example, examine something.
Example. Something such as an object, a fact, or a situation that shows, explains or supports what you say. For example, let me give you an example.
Exhibit. An object or a collection of objects put in a public place, for example a museum, so that people can see it. For example, the museum contains some interesting exhibits on Spanish rural life.
Experience. The knowledge and skill that you have gained through doing something for a period of time, the process of gaining this. For example, my lack of practical experience was a disadvantage.